Welcome everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time, Masechet Bava Batra. This is our fourth class, and today we are going to be reviewing Daf 23 through 29, which was actually yesterday's Daf. We're just keeping it even. So next week, Bezrat Hashem, back to Wednesday. And this way we're doing we'll hopefully be going back to Wednesday for a little while. Sorry for all the changes. Okay, Daf 23 begins with the Mishnah speaking about a dovecote. Right, in those days, for many years, people raised doves. Or different birds, but mostly doves. So they would have a dovecote, which was a place that the doves would live. So the Mishnah tells us that you have to distance the dovecote 50 amot from a city, which is 25 meters. I'm not sure what that is in feet. If someone wants to Google while I'm teaching, you can do that. So 25 meters from a city. And this is so that the birds don't fly into the city and eat the food from the city, right? We don't want them stealing food. If they go out into the field, so then that's okay. But we don't want them taking from the city. And if it's, and also like from your neighbors, or maybe you have to distance it 273 amot, which is called a beit kor. It's the size of a field. And this is much more. So the Mishnah says, because the dove can fly straight in each direction, so maybe it's a bigger area, right? It's not just a one direction, move to the east 50 amot, but maybe it can't be within the range, in a circular range. If a person bought a dovecote and it was already where it was, and nobody said anything about its position for 3 years, so then it creates a Chazaka. We're going to talk a lot about Chazaka towards the end of our class today. And meaning that if nobody complains, it seems that it's not bothering anybody. And if it's for 3 years, so then it's as if it's okay, and then you don't have to move it. And that would be from your neighbor. Okay, so now the Gemara explains. So the question is, right, how far can a dove fly? You can also Google that if you want. But our Gemara says that doves can actually fly far distances, but they only eat within 50 amot of their dovecote, meaning, and then they can fly right after they're full, so then they can fly a far distance. Therefore, when you're setting a trap, you have to distance it much more from a dovecote, right? If you want to make sure you're not trapping a privately owned bird, so then you need to distance it much more, because the bird can actually fly much longer, but where the dove is going to go get breakfast and dinner is going to be within 50 amot of his home, of his nest. And therefore, the dovecote has to be 50 amot from the city. We said Chazaka, right, meaning you create ownership if you've been in an area for 3 years and nobody protested. So if no one protested during the 3 years, it becomes yours. If it's sold or inherited in the meantime, right, meaning so changed owners, the court can claim the Chazaka for the new owner, right? They know if anybody has come and made a claim till the new owner came in. If there was something that was dangerous and nobody said anything for 3 years, so then again, Chazaka, and again, you don't need to move it because nobody said anything. Or no, there's no Chazaka for things that are very dangerous. And the thing that they give is an outhouse, right? So an outhouse we know is dangerous in terms of being near someone's field or someone's house. So you have to be careful to distance that from your neighbor. Okay, since we're talking about birds and distance, so the next Mishnah tells us a young bird, let's say a young bird was found within 50 amot of a dovecote, right? So you find a bird on the floor and it's, right, it can't fly. So if it's within 50 amot of the dovecote, we assume that it belongs to the owner of the dovecote. If it's outside 50 amot, so then it belongs to the finder because we don't know where it came from. If it was found between two dovecotes, then it belongs to the one that's closer. And if it's in the middle, so then you sell the bird and you split the value of the bird between the two owners of the dovecote. Okay, now the Gemara is going to get into a very interesting conversation, discussion, more of a discussion about principle. The principle is not in terms of ethics, but in terms of principles of law. We have two competing principles here. The first one is called rov. Rov means majority. And the other one is called karov, right? Which means it's right, it's close, it's proximity. And the question is, what happens? Well, we'll describe each one and then we'll give the conflict. So majority, what's majority? If you find a piece of meat on the floor and most of the stores in the area sell kosher meat, excuse me, you can assume that the meat is kosher because most of the meat in the city is kosher. That's one principle. The other principle is karov, which is proximity. We learned this in the concept of egla arufa. If you remember when we talked about finding a body outside a city and you don't know who was responsible, so the city that is closest is seen as the one that is responsible for have taken care of this person, right? So it's the closest city that is responsible. And now, right, the Gemara asks, what if these two principles conflict? What if I have, right, majority versus proximity? Which one wins, right? So I know in general they each win on their own, but which one is stronger? So the Gemara answers, we go according to majority, not proximity. We go according to the majority. Now, the Gemara keeps trying, well, what about this and what about that? So that's what we're going to do right now, right? So hold on. If you go according to majority, hold on. With Egla Arufa, with the dead body, we went according to proximity. And we didn't ask which is the bigger city, right? We didn't ask who had more people in the city. So we say, no, the city with more people is not seen as that's not seen as majority. So we're going to go according to proximity and not go according to number of people in the city, right? Our Mishnah with the bird, remember we said whichever dovecote it's closer to, that's the one that it must belong. So that seems like it's going according to proximity. And we didn't say, well, maybe only if there's no other dovecote with many birds. So the Gemara says, you're right, maybe we don't know, maybe if there was another dovecote, then we don't talk about number of birds. Let's say the Gemara asks, let's say the bird hops and doesn't fly. Therefore, right, outside of 50 amot, it couldn't have come from the dovecote, right? Because it can't hop that far. Therefore, you're allowed to keep it. And the Gemara continues back with our bird. And, you know, you love when the cases get extreme. So what if one leg of the bird is within 50 amot and one leg of the bird is outside? So they actually sent Rabbi Yirmiyah out of the Beit Midrash for this question because they thought it was disrespectful. I thought it was pretty funny. But I don't think he was trying to be funny. I think he was trying to, you know, push the boundaries. I need to take a drink again. Okay, Daf 24. Birds. So we were talking about a bird hopping like out in the middle of nowhere. However, birds that hop in a vineyard, as long as he can see his dovecote, he'll keep hopping outside of 50 amot. And therefore, that is not necessarily, we don't necessarily have to go with distance. Okay, some say that going back to our question about proximity versus majority, some say that you need two majorities, right? So majority of the butchers in the city are kosher, and most of the people that come into the city also bring in only kosher food. Then you can rely on a majority. Or maybe no, you only need one majority to be the rule. Let's say you found a barrel of wine in a river. If it's found near a Jewish city, you can drink it. And if not, you can't drink it, right? So here we're talking about proximity. Or no, you can never drink it because maybe it came from a non-Jewish city way upstream, right? And this shows that they argue about, again, majority versus proximity. And the Gemara says, no, we argue if a barrel can actually travel that far, right? Can the barrel travel so far and not get banged up or not? And last case, let's say you find a barrel of wine in a vineyard of grapes that you can't eat, meaning they're orla, they're in the first 3 years of growing, but you find a barrel of wine there. So the question is, can you drink it or not? So the Gemara says you can drink it. So here it shows, why can you drink it? Because majority of wine is permissible in the area, and it beats the proximity because it's close to these grapes that are not okay, but it seems that majority wins. And the Gemara says, no, that's not the case. Here we assume that it was stolen from another vineyard, and you're not going to hide your stolen wine barrel in the vineyard where you took the barrel from. So that wouldn't be smart. Okay. Sorry. Next Mishnah. You need, and we've seen this actually before, you need to plant a tree 25 amot from a city. Oh no, we haven't seen this one yet. 25 amot from the city. That is right. That is, you have to, we'll see why in a minute. And if it's a carob tree or a sycamore tree, you have to go 50 amot. Or maybe all trees need to be 50 amot. Aliza, you're going to love this class, by the way. It's a lot of trees, a lot of trees. Okay, so the Mishnah continues that if the city was there first, so then you're going to need to cut down the tree, and you don't get compensated for the tree because you shouldn't have planted it. But if the tree was there first, you cut it down, but you compensate the person. If you're not sure, so then you cut it down and you don't have to compensate. So now the Gemara is going to explain, why do we need to cut down the tree around the city? So the Gemara explains this is the way that they beautified the city. Every city had what was called a migrash. A migrash was 1,000 amot around the city. You weren't allowed to plant in it. And this way, I would imagine also for security, but here they talk about the beauty of the city. It's a machloket. If you make this, can you make this area into a field, right, to plant, or maybe not, or is it only about trees? It's different also if a tree is near a pit versus if the tree is near the city. That's going to be the next Mishnah, or in 2 Mishnahs, we're going to see that one, right? So we said if it's a private pit, so we say that if we're not sure which came first, you don't have to cut down the tree. But when we're talking about a city, you do have to cut down the tree, and either way, even if we can't prove which one came first. Okay, the next Mishnah. you have to distance your permanent granary 50 amot from the city. This is because you were going to thresh there. That causes a lot of, right, you're going to winnow and you're going to blow things in the air, and that's going to not be good for the people living in the city. So it needs to be distanced. And if it's on your property, it needs to be 50 amot from your neighbor and from his trees and his plowed field, so it doesn't cause any damage to his field. The end of the Mishnah seems to say less than 50 amot, maybe because it's a temporary granary. And if you use a pitchfork, you're going to throw it high, so then it has to be 50 amot. Right? What's the issue? The dust and the chaff goes into the vegetables, and it ruins the vegetables. And it also ruins the field because it turns into fertilizer, and apparently that's not always good. Lisa's going to tell us more about that at the end of the class. Okay, the next Mishnah. Sorry. You need to distance dead animals, graves, a tannery, 50 amot from the city. And you need to keep the tannery to the east of the city, or no, it can be any direction except to the west. And we'll talk more about that in the Gemara. You have to distance things that are going to cause damage, right? And we've seen this before, the soaking pools for the flax from the vegetables, and the leeks from the onions, and the mustards from the bees. Or we'll see that maybe you don't have to distance the mustard and the bees, but these things are things that damage each other, or only damage one, right? One of them damages the other. Okay, so now the Gemara explains. Can you put the tannery, again, tanneries where they're working with hide, apparently it smells really, really bad, and you don't want it near a city. So the question is, can you put it in any direction, and only on the west it has to be 50 amot, or 50 amot in any direction? And the Gemara says, you can't put it in the west at all. So sorry, 1 second. Okay. You can't put it to the west of the city at all. Now, you might think that it's because of the winds. And now the Gemara gets into a big discussion about winds. Right, there are 4 winds that blow every day, and talks about the north wind, which is good, and the south, which is harsh. But then the Gemara says, no, the reason you can't put the tannery on the west of the city is because the Shekhinah, the heavenly presence, is in the west. We're going to talk about this in a minute. Therefore, you don't put the tannery to the west of the city. And that's why we face west to daven. Now, I'm just going to remind all of you that we're learning the Babylonian Talmud, right? So the Babylonian Talmud is written in Bavel, in Babylonia, which is to the east of Israel. Therefore, in Babylonia, they are facing west when they pray, because we know that in wherever you are in the world, you're meant to face Jerusalem, which is very interesting when you get to Israel, because most of you, if you're living in North America, or anywhere actually west of us, most people just face east, right? And you talk about the eastern wall, and meaning facing to the east. But if you live in Israel, if you are north of Jerusalem, you face south when you pray. And I live to the south of Jerusalem, so I pray to the north. So it's interesting to think about when you leave your home country and travel the world, which way you're davening. But what's interesting, and we're going to see, is in our Gemara, it wasn't clear which way you're supposed to face, because we all know the famous song, right? Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. Do you know that song? If not, you can Google it. It's a very famous Chabad, I think, Lubavitch children's song, and you say up, up, down, down, right, left, he's all around, here, there, and everywhere. Hashem can be found, or someone he can be found, meaning God is everywhere. So why do we have to face a certain direction? So let's talk about that. So the Gemara says you need to face west to pray, because that's what the sun is doing. What does that mean? That when the sun sets, right? The sun sets to the west, right? When it sets, it's bowing to God, right? It's going this way. It's bowing to the west, and it must be because the sun is bowing to God, which is fascinating. Also, it's very interesting to understand that in the ancient world, most pagans prayed to the east because that's where the sun rose, and they were praying to the sun. So the Gemara continues, wait a minute, what do you mean that you, to the west, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is everywhere? And this is where it's from, right? And it brings certain verses that prove that God is everywhere. And therefore, really, you can face any direction to pray, except east, right? Because the Gemara says this is the direction that the idolaters face. Not that God isn't there, but we don't want you to look like an idolater. Since we're talking about the winds, so the Gemara talks about the world can't survive without the four winds. So too, people can't survive without Torah. And from here, the Gemara goes into a discussion about basically astronomy of the time, how they understood where the sun went at night. It's very fascinating if you want to know, like, what was going on in the times, right? The earth was flat, right? So did the sun go under the earth, or did it go, over the earth? So the Gemara discusses it here. But from here, the Gemara then discusses praying, and the Gemara says that if you want to become wise, you should daven, you should pray facing south, because that's where the menorah, the candelabra, was in the south of the temple. And if you want to become wealthy, you should pray to the north, because that's the side of the temple that had the shulchan, where they had the table for all the bread. Or you should always daven to the south, because if you're smart, you can become wealthy. So the Gemara says, no, really, you should always daven west, because if you look at the Beit HaMikdash, if you look at the temple, when you entered the temple, the Kodesh HaKodashim, the holiest place, was to the west, right? You walked from east to west. So you should pray to the west, but if you want, you can tilt a little bit south or north. Okay. But really, says the Gemara, you should always face Israel. Okay, next Mishnah, trees need to be distant from a pit 25 amot. We saw this. If it's a sycamore or a carob tree, 50 amot, they're much higher and their roots grow much, wider, and therefore they have to be 50 amot. We saw this before. If the pit was there first, you have to cut down the tree, and the pit owner compensates him. If the tree was there first, you don't have to cut it down. And if you're not sure, you don't have to cut it down. Okay, so the Gemara says, even if the pit is higher and the tree is lower, you still need to cut it down, because the root, right, you might think, oh, it's not going to go into the pit, but it will soften the dirt underneath the pit, and then it's going to ruin the pit, and therefore the stability is a problem, and then you still have to cut down the tree. However, the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, that really you don't have to cut down your tree, because when you plant it, it is not causing any direct damage, right? Even if in 10 years it's going to cause damage, right now you're not causing damage, and therefore you can actually plant your tree wherever you want. Okay. Right. Therefore, if you are causing direct damage, then you have to move that item away, right? So the winnowing of the grain is direct damage, and you would be liable. Daf 26, the Mishnah tells us that a tree next to a field must be, okay, so now it's not next to a pit and it's not next to a house, it's next to a field. So that's not really a problem. But the Mishnah says, you have to be 4 amot from the field of your neighbor, because the neighbor needs to be able to plow, right? And the plow takes up 4 amot, and therefore, which is 2 meters. Therefore, it has to be able to plow, and therefore you have to move it over. But if there's a fence, so then you can plant your tree right up to the fence. If the roots go into the neighbor's property, so the neighbor's allowed to dig them up to 3 tfachim depth into his field, meaning that's the amount that he would be plowing, 3 tfachim. So I don't know what that is, like this much. If it's deeper, right, you're not allowed to now dig up all the roots because you don't need that depth. But if you're digging a pit, you can dig the roots as far as you need, and you get to keep the wood because it's on your side of the fence. So now the Gemara explains that in Bavel, plows were narrower, and therefore, right, so therefore they said even 2 amot is okay. And then there are like stories of different trees that were near other fields, and the damage that they did cause. From here, the Gemara talks about the roots of trees. So the Gemara says that the first 16 amot of roots, which is 8 meters. Someone else can do math for feet, but 8 meters of roots is what provide the main nourishment of the tree. And you're not allowed to cut those roots. After 16 amot, you're allowed to cut the roots because those are not as important. Maybe the owner of the tree keeps the owner of the tree gets the roots, not the neighbor. So we say, right, do we go according to the tree? It's my tree, so the roots are mine. Or do we say, no, they're in my property, so they're mine? So we say, if it's within 16 amot of the tree, it belongs to the owner. And if it's after 16 amot of the tree, so then it belongs to the neighbor. The tree, hold on one second. Okay, the tree with 16 amot of boundary line, of boundary line. So really, right, the question is, if it's going into your field, so it's stealing nourishment, and therefore maybe you can't bring bikurim from these trees, right? We know that bikurim are the first fruits that are brought to the temple, and when you bring them, you say, these are my fruits, they grew on my land. So the Gemara says that if it grew 16 amot into someone else's field, it actually didn't grow in your land. It grew in someone else's land, and therefore you can't bring bikurim from these trees. And therefore, however, right, Daf 27 tells us that if you bought trees with land around it, you can bring bikurim and say the verses. And again, it has to be at least 16 amot around the tree. Okay. Right, so a tree needs 16 amot, but for a field, if you're growing grain, it could just be a small amount because the roots just go down and get their nourishment straight down, and therefore it is just a small amount of land is enough. Let's say we've definitely discussed this before because I remember Aliza discussed this with us, but we're going to discuss the root system of a tree and the nourishment that goes into the tree, right? So the Gemara says, right, if there's a tree that half in Eretz Yisrael and half outside of Eretz Yisrael, right? So do we say half, right? Every fruit in the whole tree has nutrients from both sides and therefore it's mixed, or right, because again, don't forget, you have to take trumot and ma'asrot, you have to take tithes from produce grown in Israel, but not produce grown outside of Israel. And now this tree is all mixed up, right? Or do we say, no, the fruit that grew on this side of the tree are in Israel, and the fruit that grew on this side of the tree are in outside of Israel. And there are basically two opinions, right? One is that the nutrients go in and basically go up to, the apples that grew over those roots. And the other opinion is no, the nutrients go into the trunk and it gets all mixed together and then it goes into the tree. Aliza is saying B, but it is a machloket in the Gemara, and there are obviously two different opinions as to what the fruit really is. So we say that it is complicated, and there are basically both of the opinions. The next Mishnah, a person's branch extends over somebody, right? We were talking about the roots, so now let's talk about the branch, right? The branch goes into the neighbor, over the neighbor's field. So the neighbor's allowed to cut the low branches because he needs to be able to pass with his plow, right? And the plow is with a person and he like hits the ox. So you can cut the low branches. And if it's a sycamore or a carob, you can cut away like all the branches because it's very dense. And if it's an irrigated field, you can cut all the branches, meaning because you need as much light and rain as possible, right? Because shade is bad for that type of field. Or one opinion is that all of these things is only for a non-fruit bearing tree. And we'll see this in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, when was it talking about a non-fruit bearing tree? It was talking about it with the irrigated fields when you can cut down the branches. Okay, next Mishnah, a tree growing into the public domain, right? So into a public street. So you're allowed to cut to the height of a person riding a camel, right? Meaning, what's the highest thing that can come down the street? That's how far you can cut the tree. Or no, you can cut all the branches because we're concerned about impurity, right? We know that there's the idea of tumat ohel, of impurity because of a tent, but it really means anything that's going to create a structure over you. And therefore, we're concerned that if there's a dead body, right, and then you walk under the tree, you might become impure even if you didn't see the dead body. And this is why in Jewish cemeteries, they tend to not plant trees, especially over at the edge. We actually had a place in Queens that there was like a cemetery and there were trees, and priests, right, kohanim, who should not become impure, they're not allowed to become impure by dead body, they wouldn't be allowed to walk under the trees of that street because the other side of the tree was actually overhanging the cemetery. So that's just interesting. And with that, we finished the second chapter. Okay, the third chapter is going to be dealing with the ownership of property, and specifically the law of Chazaka. And this is what we mentioned at the beginning. Chazaka means that if you have been in your house, on a field, we'll discuss many different scenarios, but if you've been somewhere for 3 years and nobody came to protest, we assume that you own it. Meaning you don't have to show, right? You can say I lost the document, I don't have the contract anymore, but I've been here for 3 years, right? And you have to prove that you've been here for 3 years. You also have to say, right, and I bought it, right? You can't just be like, I'm squatting here and nobody noticed, so I'm gonna stay. You have to say, I bought it, I got it as a present, meaning you're here legally and you've been here for 3 years. And that gives you a valid claim. Now, we're going to discuss basically two people. It's going to be two people in the scenario. The owner is going to be the person who is going to come and claim, what are you doing in my house? And then we have the occupant, right? The muhzak, the person who's been living in the house, right? And he says, what are you talking about? You sold it to me 3 years ago. So that's going to be all of our cases for the rest of today's class. Okay, so the Mishnah says, for houses and fields and slaves, you need to have used these things for 3 full years. For a field that was watered by rain, that gives only 1 crop a year, so then it's 3 years. And it doesn't have to be full. It could be like the last few months of the first year, the whole second year, and the beginning of the third year. So that's like a grain. But if he gathered 3 different types of produce from the same orchard, it can count as if it's 3 years. So if he did 3 different harvests, right? Grain, right? Oil, grapes, olives, grapes, right? Different produce. So then not grain, right? 3 different produce, that counts as 3 years. Okay, sorry, 1 second. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now the Gemara says, this is learned from the concept of the goring ox, the shor mu'ad. Now, since many of you have learned this already in Bava Kama, you remember that we learned that an ox is seen as like innocent and doesn't do things, but if he gores 3 times, then he becomes warned, and that means trouble. So the same thing here, 3, right? So what could it be? It must be 3 years. Therefore, 3 years makes a chazaka. Now, right, the person has to make a claim that he bought it or he got it as a gift, plus being there for 3 years. He can't only just say he's been there for 3 years. Then the Gemara says, well, maybe we can't use shor mu'ad, the ox, because it's not exactly parallel, right? There are ways that it's not exactly parallel, but the Gemara says that it's parallel enough to give us the concept of 3 years. And we said that 3 crops in 3 months could be a chazaka, even though it's not 3 years. This is according to the chazaka of Rabbi Yishmael. According to the sages, chazaka is learned from a verse, not from the ox. It's learned from a verse. Yirmiyahu, actually, this is very pertinent because this is right before the destruction of the temple. Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, tells the people to buy land and to take the deed, to take what was written, the contract, and put it and save it, put it in a clay jar, because they'll only be able, they're only going to be on their land for 2 more years, and then they're going into exile. Therefore, why do they have to be able to prove that they bought the land? Because they weren't on the land for 3 years. And therefore, it's a proof that 3 years will give you ownership rights when you don't need the sales document anymore. And it's very apropos for we're now in the 3 weeks and we're thinking about the destruction of the temple. Daf 29 tells us maybe maybe the Mishnah is just giving us, maybe that verse is just giving us good advice, not that it's law that if you're there for 3 years, it's automatic that you can keep the land. Rather, maybe we should just say it's logical, right? A person might let someone squat on his land for 1 year or 2 years, but definitely not 3 years. And I just want to draw your attention to this daf, daf 29, Chavtet, because there's something very interesting here. If you look on the right-hand side, this is Rashi, and it says here, Ad kan, right here, like in the middle, Ad kana perush Rashi zatzal. Till this point is the commentary of Rashi. May his soul rest in peace. From here on, it's the commentary of Rashbam, who was Rashi's grandson. And therefore, some people say that at this point, Rashi died. Others say not necessarily, that he wrote his commentary out of order. But it is very interesting that literally on that daf, it says that, that's the end of Rashi. For the rest of our Masechet, we are going to have the commentary of the Rashbam. The Rashbam is much more lengthy, and therefore our dapim are going to be shorter. So that's just something to know. I wanted you to see that. It's, I think, kind of cool. Okay, back to our Chazaka of 3 years. We said, again, after 3 years, if nobody protests, a person can keep the land, right? Maybe it should be subjective on how much a person cares or doesn't care. And the Gemara says, no, we don't want things, wait, we don't like when general laws are subjective. Therefore, right, maybe the reason is that a person will keep documents up to 3 years, right? How long do we have to keep documents for taxes? I don't even remember, but right. So maybe in those days you have, oh, wow, that's a long time. Okay. So maybe, in those days they said, look, it's reasonable to be able to keep something up to 3 years. After 3 years, you're not going to have it anymore. And therefore, at the end of 3 years, you can claim ownership even without the document. So we say, right, the owner can protest within the 3 years, even if it's not in front of the occupant, because the idea is that it'll eventually become known, right? Everybody talks, which is fascinating that the Gemara acknowledges this even before Instagram and Facebook, right, and WhatsApp and Twitter, right? But everybody, it says here, if somebody complains that you are on my land, right, and I say it to my neighbor, he's going to tell his neighbor, who's going to tell his neighbor, and you're going to hear about it. So that we'll talk more about that later on in the Masechet. The occupant needs to be there for 3 full years, and they have to be what I am like losing language skills. Consecutive years. They have to be consecutive years. But if it's a field that is usually left fallow every other year, so then it's okay if he wasn't there 1 year, meaning because there's an idea that it didn't have to be every year. Chazaka for a house, right? We say neighbors are going to know if the person used the house during the day and the night, or people who rented the house, right? Or you can say like, oh, I lived in that house and I saw that person all the time, right? If the owner demands to see witnesses to prove that the occupant was in the house day and night, so then he has to bring those witnesses, meaning the owner can say, prove to me that you were here for 3 years. If it's a storefront, you don't need to prove day and night, right? Because stores are only used during the day. You cannot establish a chazaka if 2 people jointly used something. So here we have the case which we actually learned about in the last Masechet, we had Rami Bar Chama and his brother who inherited a servant. Here it's that they bought her, but it says that they jointly used the servant, right? One used it, one used her year 1, 3, and 5, or let's say 1 and 3. No, 1, 3, and 5, and the other used it 2, 4, 6. But no one person used her consecutively, and therefore you can't combine the two, and they don't have a chazaka actually. And if you used only, what if you have a big field and you didn't use the whole field? Maybe you left off a little part, and you didn't use that little part for 3 years. You get a chazaka only for the part that you used. But if that land isn't farmable, so then you can acquire it with the rest of the land. Or no, you need to do something on that land, put the animals there or do something. But if you don't do anything, then you don't acquire it. Okay, wow. Okay, since we have a few minutes, I'm happy to, maybe I'll stop the recording. So, and then if you want, we can ask some questions. So wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom, and see you Be'ezrat Hashem next week on Wednesday. I'm really sorry about all the changing, but I really appreciate everybody's flexibility.